All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is great. I'm glad we finally got a chance to meet. This is how we meet nowadays, through Zoom, right?
Yes,
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization and what you're passionate about?
sure. My name is Charlene Lee. I'm the Chief Research Officer at a consulting firm called PAConsulting. And we really focus on building the power of ingenuity to power a positive human future. So that's what we're all about. So I know we talk about future innovation, and this company is just amazing at not coming up with only the ideas, but also bringing them to life, actually making them. So it's very fun
Very,
to do.
very cool. So tell us a little bit about the kind of work that you do, like maybe specific examples.
Sure. I do a lot of research into future trends. Historically, I've been focused on digital and digital transformation, leadership, strategy, disruption strategies in particular. And I'm turning my eye towards what I call wicked problems. These are things like, little things like sustainability and
Mhm.
climate change.
Small
And
things.
how do we fix capitalism, right? And they seem to be intractable. And yet I see us all making progress towards really addressing these things. So really want to point out the best practices, identify some of the challenges, and really what I'm passionate about, identifying actions that we can take today that'll impact our future.
That's really interesting. So let's go back to the capitalism one. So did somebody say to you, hey, we need help doing this? Or is this something that was just generated internal to PA? Like we need to fix this problem.
Well, I think, again, people talk about it existentially, and there's a lot of movements around to talk about stakeholder-based capitalism, conscious capitalism, ESG. They all kind of go around us, which is to say our business models, our underlying premises and assumptions don't seem to be working. Inequality in terms of wages and living standards are splintering rather than coming together. And capitalism was actually really good at this. It was
Mm-hmm.
really good at raising our income levels, our standards of living, up until the 1970s. And then various things happened. There's a great book by David Gallup out right now, The Man Who Broke Capitalism, about Jack Welch. And the combination of that
I knew
focused
that guy had
on
something to do with it.
yeah. And that along with shareholders, shareholder value is the purpose of an organization, increasing that from Milton Friedman. A lot of things converged at that same time, along with the oil crisis. So there's a lot of stuff historically that we can look at these patterns and say, we're at a really interesting inflection point right now, where a lot of things are coming together, including this whole idea, like, could we actually change this? And I think there's enough energy around it and enough momentum behind it that talking to CEOs, yes, there's a desire to change it.
Yeah, and this has to come from the businesses themselves. I mean, it can't be just by government fiat saying, this is what you need to do, right?
The government's going to be following the businesses. It's
Yeah,
always been the case.
exactly.
They respond to what businesses and the abnormalities that come up because of business, and then try to regulate it down with governance. But I think, again, there's market reasons to think that this is actually a really good thing, because investing in our communities, investing in our environment, investing in workers is a good thing. You see Amazon advertising about how they give healthcare and they give people time off for work. That's not necessarily the spirit of making more money for the bottom line, but they realize that at some point, there's got to be a limit to this, and you've got to reinvest back.
Yeah, if you think about it, it's sort of like this crisis, this COVID crisis, actually drove people, especially if you think about the Great Resignation, where people were just basically quitting their jobs because they realized they didn't want to do this anymore. They wanted to do something that wasn't necessarily making money, but would be more fulfilling. And this kind of lines up with that as well, too. People are looking for a more fulfilling life than just sort of working hard.
Yeah, 45% of Gen Z, the latest generation coming up in their early 20s now, 45% would rather work for a company with a strong purpose than get paid more.
Interesting.
They were willing to take a lower paying job to be working at a company where they're aligned with the purpose.
That's funny, because so many companies are out there, they're still kind of purposeless, right? They're just like, our purpose is making money for our shareholders. Our purpose is making, increasing our profits. They don't have a purpose outside of that. They don't have a purpose outside of capitalism, and they're realizing they've got to have one.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I joined PAConsulting. is because it's so personally aligned to what I want to accomplish. My personal purpose is to catalyze transformation, to maximize human potential. And PA's is to tap into the power of ingenuity to build human future.
Mhm.
So very, very, very similar in terms of the direction and the outcomes that we want to see. And I think it's one of the greatest blessings. I mean, the best days, the perfect days, great days are when you can live your values.
Yeah,
So, and
absolutely.
you feel that your values have been lived and the work that you do and the people you're around. So I have great days at work because I'm working with people who are aligned with my values. And we
Mhm.
talk about our purpose and our values all the time, internally and externally. So it's really good to be aligned in that way.
But it seems to me that for some organizations, it would be really hard to make that shift. I mean, how do you help them make that shift?
It starts at the top, the board and the CEO. And
Mhm.
again, if they don't buy into it, it's going to be very, very difficult to do that. Again, you can create this groundswell from beneath, but at some point, it's got to get the people at the top to truly believe in it, not just have words out there, but talk about it all the time.
Mhm.
You know, one of the things we do as a company is we have that purpose statement as a first slide in every one of our decks. It is the first slide.
Right.
And it's a reminder to people and a reminder to ourselves, this is why we're here. This is what we're trying to do with this work. And when you have that in mind, you approach the work just a little bit differently. You're
Mhm.
thinking about that future. You're thinking about not just a short-term gain. You're thinking about the implications for what you do with that future in mind. And that's not always the case.
Yeah. Well, I love it because this is an optimistic vision, and I've always had an optimistic vision on where things are going. And it just seems that there's so much pessimism out there where, you know, almost every time we've been faced with a difficult problem, we've been able to solve it, or at least we make inroads towards solving it. How do you get people to understand that things are actually better than they look?
Well, I mean, if you're a leader, truly a leader, not a manager, you're a leader, you're creating change because you believe in a better future.
Mhm.
Leaders create change. If you're not creating change, then you're a manager, which is fine, but you're holding on to the status quo. And that's where the pessimism lives because there's nothing I can do to make a change happen. I don't have agency to make it happen. And leaders imbue with a strong sense of agency, of purpose, see the future, and they see opportunities. That's the key thing is,
Mhm.
and they not only see the opportunities, they believe that the people around them, the organization, are the right people with the right skills and capabilities at the right time to make this happen. It's not going to be easy. They're very realistic and pragmatic about this. They're not just looking at this with what I call toxic positivity. Of course, we're going to win. Like failure is not an option. You know, just those kinds of false toxic positivity doesn't help anybody because it doesn't acknowledge the challenge and the struggle we're going to go through in order to meet that future.
I love that term, toxic positivity. I got to use that.
We
So
know so many people like that,
yeah,
right?
it's so awesome.
Yeah.
So I find that one of the biggest stumbling blocks is fear of change. I mean, you could have people in the upper echelons understanding that things need to change and seeing the positive benefits of the change, but how do you convince the rest of the organization, the ones who've sort of been embedded in this and go, you know, nothing will ever change, it doesn't matter what they say? How do you get that message through?
Yeah, what you find is that there's this frozen middle. The people at the top want to see the change strategically, you know, from a leadership perspective, they go, we have to do this change. The people at the front lines who deal with customers every day, they see the change happening. They need to go out and make this change happen too. So they're bought in. It's that middle manager level where their entire existence is defined by filtering information up and making sure decisions are followed. So their
Mhm.
purpose is to maintain the status quo, and you're asking them to change it. So of course they don't want to change it because they don't know what that change is going to mean for them. So the way that I see what I studied is how some organizations just seem to change constantly. They're constantly revising themselves, disrupting themselves, chasing after that future. And I was curious how they do it. And one of the most interesting things is they actually have these processes geared towards that middle management, geared towards change. It's not processes geared towards the status quo. Everything is geared towards making it easy to change. So give an example. do most organizations have a process for spinning up new businesses, examining innovation gates, whatever? That's great. Do they have a similar process for shutting things down? Because you can't take on new things without taking off old things off the table. And yet most organizations have no process for that. These organizations have a process for knowing far, far in advance when they're going to sunset products, services, departments, people, teams, and they can plan accordingly. And they're really good at it. And they know these resources are going to be available at this time and date to be redeployed back into the organization. So change is easy for them.
Because they assume change is going to happen, and the foundation for change is already there.
Yeah. So if you shift your mindset from change manager to managing change, it's a flip of the words, but it's significant change in the way that you think about change and disruption and innovation. You just realize that you have to gear everything in the organizations towards constantly revising, changing, and not only changing, but creating order at the same time. Change and then order, change and then order.
Yeah, because sometimes I think that change management is sort of like lip service for, hey, this change is coming. We'll tell you all about it. We'll give you enough information about it, but it's going to happen, and we can't stop it. We're just telling you about it, and we're not really managing change, right?
And the thing is that people go through change. Think about our personal growth, right? We don't go from state A to state B in a snap. We have this thing called a transition time. We have a time of transformation. We call this the messy middle, or in psychological terms, we call it the liminal space. And I think as leaders, we need to do a much better job of creating liminal space, of creating space for that messy to happen, because you can't go from state A to state B without that change in you, without some sort of transformation. And some people will take more time, other people will take less time, but our expectation and measurement of success isn't go from A to B as quickly as possible. If anything, we should give more time, more space, hold that container for people so they feel secure going through that change and being able to, in some cases, deal with grief and loss of the status quo, of the world that they knew, and to prepare themselves for this new space, a new change, a new way of behaving and being. And that takes time. You can't give them infinite amount of times because you say, we got to make this change. But to acknowledge that the change is hard, acknowledge that there is a sense of loss, and to hold that space for people as they make that change. We do it with graduations. We do it beautifully with graduations. We do it so well with weddings, these rituals. And yet we've removed rituals from our corporate life. We removed it from our personal lives. And so we don't have these anchors to hold us, to give us that space to make these changes.
Well, that's absolutely, that's spot on, because I feel that that's exactly what's happening. I think we have too much sort of rip off the Band-Aid type of change management, where we make the change quick and we'll just get through it to the other side. It's kind of like when you're playing craps and somebody craps out, let's just go to the next player, instead of sort of really understanding the transition period. So I think having that adequate amount of transition between the change is really important, like you say.
Yeah, it's a more humane way of thinking about this, to say that, change is hard, and let's acknowledge it. And it's not to coddle people. It's not being soft. If it's anything, it's being very pragmatic and acknowledging the fact, what we're asking you to do is really different than what you did before. I was speaking to some plant managers of a manufacturing plant, and they go, change, you've been told our entire careers that change is bad, because when things go wrong, when change happens, people die. And we don't want that to happen. And now you're telling us, go forth, failure is an option. Like, no, failure is not an option in this manufacturing plant.
Yeah.
So how do you bring these two ideas together when your entire career you've been told, don't make mistakes, don't fail? Innovation, unless it's a really well thought out, well executed thing, just doesn't happen. So, and now we're trying to reverse all of that. You can't expect that to happen overnight.
Right. But you know what? I mean, life has changed, though. I mean, existence is change. So if you say we can't change, then it's almost going against life and nature, if you think about it.
And
so we just have to understand.
Yeah,
Go
we have
ahead.
to understand what change means for people and why is it so hard. And again, in some cases, some people really, in very, very few cases, people really, really, really dislike change. They don't like anything to change. They like, I met one guy who has eaten the same breakfast for 20 years.
Wow.
20 years, the same exact thing for 20 years. And yet in his work and everything, he's explosively disruptive and innovative. But his anchor is the same breakfast every single morning, which is crazy, right? So we have these areas. And so these organizations are very, very stable. These disruptive, transformational organizations have a lot of stability. So they know that they can argue with each other, go to town with each other, completely disagree, and be perfectly fine.
Mhm.
Go out for a drink after work, go on vacation.
I think I know some married couples like that. They're just like that.
And their
They have a
relationship
very
is
strong
so,
relationship, but they're always arguing.
yeah. And the thing is that you are so secure in your relationship with each other at work that you can tell each other, like, I think that's crazy. Why are we doing this? Well, and they listen. And then the very important thing is if they really disagree, this is again, that leadership principle that comes from Amazon of disagree and commit, which I just think is so beautiful. We can completely disagree, but when the decision comes down, whichever way it goes, we know we will be 100% committed to that.
Mm-hmm.
There's no sandbagging. There's no backstabbing or backroom politics happening. 100%.
What do you think of, sorry, speaking of that, what do you think of the sort of like the radical, what is it called?
Radical transparency, Ray Dalio.
Yeah. What do you think of radical transparency? What are your thoughts on that?
It's, everyone has to be prepared for it. Everyone has to know.
That's what I've heard.
That, but it is fantastic. Mm-hmm. because you then examine, why do I feel uncomfortable with this? What are the emotions? What am I fearing? What's really underlying me not wanting to say this? And I think it comes back to integrity in our relationships. We all believe we live with integrity. And yet we'll leave things unsaid between each other because it's just uncomfortable to talk about that. Is that a relationship in integrity? No, it's not. So how can you leave anything ever unsaid in a relationship that's meaningful? So I do believe that radical transparency, candor, done with kindness, with consideration, with compassion. And that's the key difference. It isn't just telling you exactly anything that's on my mind. It's in the purpose of building this incredibly strong relationship where there's nothing left unsaid, everything is cleared, and our relationship is completely strong so we can focus on the work.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because I feel that as human beings, we always have facades, right? We have different facades for different occasions. And with something like radical transparency, if the facade is pretty much gone, or have you created yet another facade, which is a radically transparent facade? I don't know.
Well, there's this whole idea of bringing your whole self to work, right? And yeah. I found that as a woman of color, that I would check things at the door, and as a parent, especially, I would check things at the door. And so I wouldn't bring my full self. I would put on that facade. And I knew it was absolutely true because I would have work friends and personal friends get together, and the work friends like, you are so different. And I'm like, really? I don't feel any different.
Reminds me of Seinfeld, George's worlds colliding thing. Do you remember that?
Yeah. And I definitely felt that on Facebook early on because there was no way to create all these different groups, and I just finally gave up. But when you have these radically different worlds that you show different faces to, it's really hard to reconcile them. And so when you have to do that at work, it just means that you just spend more energy than necessary to have to keep track of what I do here, what I not do here. And when you can bring all of yourself, all the highs and the lows, the wonderful expansive experiences that you've had, this diversity of experience, and not fear that it will be judged. I have the immigrant family experience, but if I feel like somebody's judging me because of that, because of the history or the food, whatever it is, then I'm not going to be as willing to bring that experience to the table, and we all lose because of that. So when you can bring your whole self to work, when you can have that honest conversation, when you feel it's just a twinge of just, something isn't right, and you have the ability to go and check it out. mean, we have come so far with COVID. You know, we now talk about the stresses of life. We feel comfortable because we have literally been in each other's bedrooms. How much more intimate can we be?
Oh yeah, exactly.
Right? And so, like,
well, some people say that the internet makes things less intimate, but I think it's the opposite. It's the opposite, because you're right. I mean, we were transmitting right into each other's deepest, innermost thoughts, really.
Yeah. I mean, we all have friends who we talk to, and we feel like we connect with them so well, even if it's just by text messages or on a Twitter conversation or just phone calls. I mean, we know we have sustained friendships over continents and time zones, years, just through letters. And you're telling us we can't do it through these technologies? I don't buy it. We've done this for a long time in terms of being able to sustain our relationships with each other. So it's a total cop-out from my point of view.
Well, I think it can facilitate and extend relationships that would have normally died, right? I mean, that's one of these things. I know I talk to people on Facebook that I've known since high school, and if it hadn't been there, then I wouldn't be talking to them. So that connection would have been lost.
Yeah, the foundation for relationships are communications and time spent. And we have, so you have communications, you're talking to each other about common interests. You work on something together, or you have kids who go to school together, or you have a passion, you know, like dog training or something. And, and the more time you spend with each other, the deeper that relationship gets. And what technology allows us to do is to transcend time and space, especially with asynchronous communications. I don't have to be at the same time with you. I can have multiple conversations with people at the same time and sustain them. And so the scale and the tenor and the types of relationships we have are incredibly different now. And the possibilities are just infinite.
Oh, absolutely. Especially if you think about the whole communities of interest. I mean, this started when I did a stint at Yahoo, this whole thing came out of it, where originally we were all geographically focused, right? I mean, I had friends that were around me, my neighbors, et cetera, my family, but now we can have friends all over the world. We can have communities of interest that are completely global and find people everywhere else that are interested in the same things as me. I think that's incredibly empowering.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the same time, we realize that the in-person relationships and those touch points are so valuable. I mean, we saw that definitely coming out of COVID, but it's a different type. It's not the only, and it's not necessarily the best, because there are all these other mixed signals that we're just overwhelmed with that our brains can't handle. So how we picking up everything that we get. So again, some people need more time and space to be able to process all that, again, which is why asynchronous communications can be a real boon for them. Yeah. We think that we are very human, but we all know, we've all met people, we've worked with people, have them in our families, people who have low EQ, who have low empathy. And I do believe that technology can help with that. Because technology doesn't have any bias. It doesn't get tired. It can continue to sustain and have empathy and give you that information. I imagine at some point we'll have empathy glasses that we can put on that'll just give us a little signal to tell us, you know, this person, you're not picking up on it, or, you know,
you're popping, emojis are popping up in this your field of vision.
Yeah, exactly. You know, the number one thing, the most powerful feedback to give leaders is that they're taking up too much space. They're talking too much in the meeting. They should never talk more than 50%, and ideally much less than that. And they can get a little shock or something because it tracks how often are they speaking. And
more listening, less talking, right?
Exactly. And yet, it's like the most basic empathy tool.
So are you finding that with COVID and all these crises that we seem to be going through, that people are really sort of tightening up their strategy and looking at shorter and shorter terms and not really looking at the long term anymore, or as much as they used to?
If anything, they're looking further out. If anything, they're looking further out, because they know historically that they have done short-term planning pretty well. And the biggest gap that they have right now is true strategic planning. It's going out 3-5 years and then laying out a really strong operating plan and model to make that happen. You look at any strategy, I ask people to give me strategies, and it's their budget. The budget is not the strategy. They go through an annual planning process for the next 12 months. And by the time they get to the last quarter, they only have a quarter of planning left. That doesn't make any sense. And yet the vast majority of companies run this way. The best way to do it is what I call a 6-quarter walk, where you have 6 quarters planned out against your long-term objective, but 6 quarters of operational details. And with Q6 as detailed as Q1, which never is. And then each quarter, you're expanding it to another quarter, and you're checking against your strategy constantly. So you're doing strategic planning and budgeting every single quarter. And if you do this well and do this right with a full knowledge of what the signals are to tell you, like, these things should be changing and shifting, you have a much better operating model to be able to do that. Again, an organization and everything geared towards change, rather than assuming that things only change once a year for you to review in your annual planning process.
Oh yeah, it changes way more often than that. This sounds like you're taking futurist techniques and moving them into the strategic planning process. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, if you think about scenario planning, it's done once every 3 years or something. Then you do your big.
Oh man, that is not often enough.
No, I mean, basically you create these scenarios and you make them become alive. You run them all and you anticipate which of these things may be happening. And so the people who did really good scenario planning had regular practices of wargaming around preparedness and resilience, also turn those things into and put them into the growth strategies that they have. Because, and especially right now where everyone is thinking that the recession is looming, right? It's looming really big in our eyes. We don't know how big it's going to be, if it's going to be a soft one, it's going to be an extreme one, but it's coming. It's inevitably coming. And so many people are saying, like, how are we going to cut? What are we going to hold back on? And the really smart people are saying, where are we going to accelerate? They're looking into this future and saying, where are the opportunities going to be in the recession? Where are we going to play? Where are acquisitions going to be much more affordable than they are these sky-high prices today? Where's the talent going to be that we can invest in because we see this future coming? And our future's 3 to 5 years out, it's recession-proof. And we're just going to keep focusing on that long term, knowing that there are some short-term issues that we have to deal with, but we're going to see all of those as opportunities.
Yeah. Instead of cowering in fear, understanding that it's coming and dealing with it, because it's something that's going to happen anyway. I mean, it's something that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah. And if you look at all the crises that ever happened, the financial crises back in 2008, 2009, you look at COVID, the people who did really well are the ones who invested early in that process. And there were also great times of huge innovation that were coming out. So you look at the innovation rates, and our research has shown that a lot of leaders at the beginning of 2022 were saying, wow, the past 2 years were really disruptive, but we anticipate the next 2 years to be even more so, even more disruptive than the past 2 years. And they're gearing them up. They're gearing themselves up for this. And I thought maybe a few people would say it was the vast majority of people believe that.
Is there a particular flavor to the disruption that is coming along, or we just know it's going to be disruptive? We just don't know what it's going to be.
That the pace of change is going to be even faster. The expectations of customers, of employees, and having to deal with all these different stakeholders is a real challenge for leaders now. They didn't have to deal with this before. They didn't have empowered employees. The employees were pretty happy to just have a job. That's not the case anymore.
Yeah.
They can get any job. It's a war for talent, a true war for talent now.
So that's interesting. So we're talking about the Great Resignation a little bit earlier. Where do you think those people are going? All these people who are quitting, are they just going back to similar roles at other organizations, or are they off doing their side hustles? Where do you think these people are going?
A good chunk of them, I don't have the numbers in front of me, a good chunk of them are making their side hustles or their new businesses work because there's so much demand. There's so many opportunities for new services. They're like, oh, my side hustle is becoming more interesting and more lucrative than my main job. Why am I still doing this? I'm going to do my side hustle now. And then the other part of it is they're doing the same job at other places because they get paid more. And they work for a better boss. People don't leave companies, they leave leaders and managers. And like, I can do the same job for somebody who actually will treat me like a human being. Yeah. And I may even get paid less, but I'm going to be happier. So people
which is kind of like a flip side, because we've all been looking at the money part of the equation. And a lot of people are no longer looking at. I think that's another part of it, is that this crisis has driven people to say, I'll take less money as long as I get a more fulfilling role.
I mean, how many bosses at the beginning of COVID said, we're all going back to the office 5 days a week? Damn what the employees say. I mean, everybody was saying that. Everybody was saying that. You do not hear that anymore.
No.
Because, you know, so
a little bit of backlash,
really
right?
Fast change. In the course of a year, corporate America has basically given up that fight. And have admitted that, you know, flexible hybrid work situations are here to stay.
Well, isn't there a huge disconnect? Isn't there a huge disconnect between what the leaders think and what the employees are thinking? I mean, when it comes to hybrid work?
In some cases, yes. And it's because the leaders feel like they have more control when people are in the office. But when you challenge it, like, wait, what did you do over the past 2 years?
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
you can do your job just as well from home. It's that we've proven it.
So how do you justify adding 2 hours a day to people's productivity, take away from that? And they're incredibly unhappy, and they're going to go to another competitor. All you need is one competitor who says, you can work anytime you want. Please come into the office because you want to.
Yep.
We want you to come in, and they make it attractive for you to come in and give you reasons to come in. Versus you must come in 4 out of 5 days a week. You must work these hours. Forget the fact that you have kids in school who are out. I mean, it's just not tenable.
Oh,
so
yeah.
When you
I mean,
have other options, it's not going to work.
Exactly. I mean, when you look at the positives and the negatives overall, I mean, it's better for health. It's better for wellness. It's better for the planet. It's just better for everybody all around. But
it does require that you adjust the way that you think you want to lead. I keep saying to leaders, how are you going to show up? What's the most important thing here? And what they oftentimes forget, that leadership is just a relationship between people who are creating the change and inspiring the change, and people who choose to follow them.
Yeah.
So that's all leadership is. It has nothing to do with your title, it has nothing to do with the org chart and who's on your team. That could all be there, and you will not be a leader if people do not choose to follow you, if they're not inspired to create that change.
Exactly right. You have to, I think they think that the relationship is inverse, right? That they have the control, but it's actually the employees that have the control.
Yeah. Talk to any CEO. You know what it's like. We are so not in control. We're at the beck and call of everybody else.
We're not running anything.
No, not at all. Everything's running us. And so this is the difference of working in the business versus working on the business. So when you can draw yourself away from that time to work on the business and have that perspective, and which is, again, I look at these leaders and their calendars are just completely packed from dawn to dusk. There's no time in there to think, to feel, to listen. And so the best leaders, the leaders of these big disruptive organizations, they don't have very many things on their calendars.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so it's time for our segment. Think like a futurist. It's the year 2032, 10 years from now. What do you think the world's going to be like? Where will we be at in 10 years?
You know, it's going to look a lot like it does today. We'll still be driving cars. That's not going to change very much.
We won't have autonomous vehicles?
I wish. A few bit on the edges, you know, a little bit on the edges, but not for the vast majority.
It can't happen fast enough for me, you know, seeing all these horrible drivers on the road. I got to say, human beings should not be driving.
Just hand it over to the robots.
That's right.
But I think that the biggest difference is that I look at it from the point of view of relationships, and our relationships will be so much more multifaceted. We will have such better AR and VR tools that these interactions will feel like they're real. I mean, that technology is not that far away. And we won't need big, huge, awful headgear to make it happen either. It'll be shrinking all the way down to just glasses. I don't think we'll be down to the place of contact lenses and embedded lenses or anything like that. But definitely down to glasses, where the way that we see the world, when you put these on, the information that you have is going to be tremendous. My biggest concern is that that's going to create a significant difference between the have and have-nots of the metaverse and being in it, all the AR and the Web3 kind of technologies. And by then, I think that because it's so thin and small, and things will be embedded in so many of our devices, embedded into our own phones, that it may not actually be that much of a barrier and be a great equalizer.
Mm-hmm. So do you see, I think I'm waiting for the Apple AR, because whatever Apple does is definitely more sort of consumer focused. So it's definitely going to be more broad ranged, designed for everyone. So do you see that that's sort of going to be the thing that really drives AR into the mass market?
Well, if you think about the Apple ecosystem, the thing that really broke it open were the apps. It was not the hardware, it was the apps. It was the application of these technologies for that. And so for the technology, think about all the applications that AR could be fantastic for. I saw one the other day, folding laundry. I was like, oh, yes, it'll understand. I dump everything on there and it will just say really quickly, I just put it on and I don't even have to think. I just have to move it. A robot's really bad at folding laundry, but my hands are fantastic. But I can't figure out, is this kid's underwear, is that kid's underwear? Whose clothes is this, right? I can just sort into piles. Yeah, I can just quickly sort into piles and then give it to them to fold, kind of thing.
That's exactly how you're supposed to do it.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, so this is why I do think that applications of AR and VR are going to be so interesting, because how many apps are there? I mean, how many apps do you have on your phone? We're constantly discovering new ones. And the entertainment aspects of this, where storylines break out of the screen, a flat screen, and become played out in your neighborhood. You think about Pokemon Go, right? And you had
that was phenomenal. It was just it was amazing.
You got out,
and that was just a tiny little glimpse into AR. And I can't imagine what it's going to be like when we actually have more immersive experiences.
I mean, imagine storytelling in the park, and they go to a local cafe and they go into a bookstore and you follow along with them as the story unfolds in real time with that AR experience. And play it out in front of you without the need of any scenery, because the scenery was actually blocked with the AR. And so the opportunities for storytelling, for experiences, for the things that make our life so rich, and besides just the sheer utilitarianism of this, I think we're going to see some significant differences over the next 10 years.
Yeah, no, I'd love to be sitting in a park having this conversation. or maybe if you're thinking about the story time, the first thing that came to my mind is a bunch of kids sitting around with AR goggles in their own parks, but all looking like they're sitting beside each other and can look over at each other and speak to each other and get a story being told by somebody who's also remote, but feeling like they're all in the same park doing the same thing. I mean, I think that technology is phenomenal. You think it'll be here in 10 years?
Yes, because first of all, we're already doing this in the metaverse. And so in so many places, in Roblox and Minecraft and all the online communities that you have, granted, we may be running around in blocks, in suits and everything, but the amount of storytelling and the relationships that's in these communities, it's absolutely real. And you do literally feel like you're with these people when you meet up with your friends in real life. You just continue the conversations. It's astounding to see these young people do that, and people even my age doing this. So the reality is, the technology says, okay, that's instead of completely virtual world, how are we going to take it into a semi-virtual world and back and forth? And so, yes, you take that as an extension, a natural place for that community to be. You take AR and you just do it on your phone even for now.
Yeah.
And you can create these environments that are just incredible.
So speaking of Web3, you mentioned Web3 earlier, which I thought was interesting. So where do you think cryptocurrency is going to be? Do you think it's actually going to start replacing fiat currency, or central banks are going to start issuing it, or where do you think it's going to be in 10 years?
I'm not a good expert on this one, but my sense is currencies are really tricky, right? It's dependent on people seeing and acknowledging that the value is there. And so unless it's pegged to something of value other goods and services that it's in that ecosystem, it's really hard to gauge what that value is. And right now it's a province of a small, very small number of people who are hyper enthusiastic about crypto. So they're all just creating this echo chamber. And we've seen this happen over and over again. It's not a real economy, right? So when it actually comes into our real economy and actually people are using it in stores, not just a few coffee shops that take crypto, right? But there is real value attached to it. I think, I can't remember the name of it, the Facebook attempts at creating a crypto currency.
Yeah, it was originally called Libra, but then they think they
Libra,
changed the name to something else. Yeah,
exactly. And I knew some of the teams of people there, and it was fascinating, the optimism that they have, but it's extremely hard. You have to get everyone else in the rest of the currency exchanges to actually acknowledge the value of that, so that people can literally exchange their US dollars, which is the international currency of the world, for that currency.
exactly.
And you can do that a little bit today, but it's still not at that point where there's enough confidence in the currency to make that happen.
Well, what about NFTs? I'm going to take this interview and put it and NFT it and sell it for $3 million, and we can share the proceeds. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. If you got a buyer, I got a bridge for them too. NFTs, one of the most interesting things about that is, how do you know that you own the original copy?
Exactly.
Right? If you're, again, I know some artists who refuse to use NFTs because of the environmental aspects of it. So they're waiting for green NFTs, green crypto to come out, and green NFTs come out. In the meantime, other people are selling their goods, their digital art, their digital music and everything, under the pretense that, yeah, this is issued. So it looks at the certificate, looks at the real thing, it's an NFT. So, oh, I didn't know the artist was doing that. And the artist's like, no, it's not mine. Somebody's taking my art and putting it into an NFT. There's nothing that they can do to prevent that from happening.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
that level, that again, it's one of those things, is how do you develop trust? How do you actually create value in something when anything can become a fungible token? Did you actually own it in the very beginning? What is the value behind it? And the most interesting tokens are the ones that are being associated with personalities, with people and their values, not just the value of the token, but services and connection and access to communities that are much more interesting, I think, from a token standpoint, than there's a straight out ownership of digital goods, which is a very specific place of NFTs, very, very specific place. But this whole question of ownership using smart contracts and tokens to denote that there is something scarce that can be owned. And how do you create a sense of scarcity when, frankly, digital is infinite? And it's all the people around that place. And so you see these real estate plots inside of different metaverses happening. There is real value to that because there's only so many in that community. And so the sense of scarcity and boundaries is what really creates value.
But isn't the scarcity sort of false? Because you can just say, I'm going to create a 100 by 100 acre lot in whatever world, and then I can always add more to it too, because it's totally virtual. You're
dependent on the creators saying, I'm not going to add anymore.
Yeah.
Right. But we'll also
what if they change their mind later?
Well, we're also dependent on our government not to print more money to raise the inflation rate and lower the value of our currency. So it's very, very similar, right? There may be reasons why that ecosystem needs to print more space, create more space to get more money in. So, but it devalues the people who are already there. So yeah, it's a tricky thing. It's a very tricky thing, understanding demand and supply and scarcity to create value.
So where do you think we'll be, like, as a human race in 10 years? You think we'll be very different?
Yeah, again, look at how different we are just over the past 2 years. Right. But it's changing so incrementally along the way that we never quite notice it. Again, just some of the biggest implications for our society is we have a generation of kids who are set back in education, set back in their social development. They're socially developing in completely new and different ways. And have we, as their parents, understood what that means and the implications of it? We're going to be unwinding this for decades to come. And so I think in 10 years, that generation will be moving into management. In 10 years, the people who are completely disenfranchised from having a say in the future. We hear from kids all the time, you adults are messing it up and you don't seem to, right? They're going to get into a place, and they're being shaped so much by that now. They're going to be in a place 10 years from now where they will actually be in a place to make change happen. And the optimism of youth, hopefully it hasn't been beaten out of them, and they will still want to make that change happen. That's the fingers crossed. I think if they can hang on, if they can just hang on to that optimism and that desire to create change until they are actually in places of power to be able to do that, we'll be in a really good place.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, but I'm seeing there just seems to be so much divergence. There's an optimistic track and there's a pessimistic track, and I always want to go down the optimistic track, and I hope that that is the one that prevails in the end anyway.
Yeah, and the way that that's going to happen is for us adults, us grown-ups, to wake up to the fact that the world is changing and we've got to take action. We need more optimists and not to be dragged down by the pessimists. Well, there's, climate change, well, is it real? And then the second part is, there's nothing I can do about it. It's bigger than me. It's higher than my pay scale. The politics, the changes in capitalism, there's nothing I can do. That's like the way the system is done. It's an entire ecosystem thing that nobody can change anything about that. If we fundamentally give up on that notion that there's nothing to be done, there's nothing we can do, then yeah, the world is going to backslide. But I do believe that if we can keep coming up as leaders to say, oh, there is something we can do. Here is the path forward, and we're going to go on this path. Who will join me?
Yeah, well, we were talking about it before. It's ingenuity. Human ingenuity has been able to solve all of these issues in the past, and I think we can continue doing that in the future. I think a lot of times when you have dystopian visions and pessimistic visions, you're thinking, oh, these things are so horrible, there's nothing I can do about them, like you just said. But the reality is we've done it before. We've made positive change in the past, and we just have to continue doing it into the future.
Yeah, but if you think about the power of dystopian storylines and environments, it's because the world is so dark, and then a hero shows up. A hero shows up who doesn't even know that they're a hero, and they're thrust out of their everyday into a new environment, and they discover all these capabilities that they never knew they had, and they rise to the occasion. So I think the dystopian fantasies that we have always have an optimistic view in them, and that one person can make a difference. And so if we buy into that story, how can we make that happen? How do we set the stage if we're not going to do it to allow that new hero to come forward? And when they do emerge, to embrace them, to nurture them, to encourage them and cheer them along, rather than be one of the obstacles like flinging arrows at them again and again.
We're not the bad guys. We're the heroes or the guides.
Yeah, exactly.
This has been great. Thank you so much. This is fantastic. So if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
Best way is to go to my website, charlenelee.com, send me a message from there, or connect with me on LinkedIn. So Charlene Lee. There's only one of me out there, as far as I know.
Fantastic.
So it's pretty easy to find me.
Okay, great speaking with you. This is fantastic. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you for your time.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Okay.